Our next speaker is visiting us from Boston, from Mass General and Harvard Medical School. Keith Miller, also a long relationship with Ted. We had a really enjoyable dinner last night. He told me that Ted would often ask Keith to be a consultant on his grants so that he would have to recuse himself from the NIH study section. So, a technique I wish I knew earlier, however.
I'm not sure why I'm not. I'm not an anesthesiologist, but I'll do my best. Ted and I guess, revolved around the center of the universe for us, the mechanisms of anesthesia for longer than I care to remember, let's say 50 years. So I thought I'd start. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah, okay. God, I've got to figure out which of these works. Doesn't really matter. So I thought I'd start with, welcome many people at Mass General. Happy that I was coming here and asked to please remember Mass General. So this was on the occasion when Ted gave a talk at the Ether Dome, and it was towards the end of his career. Oh, there we go. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Okay. And afterwards, we took these nice pictures. If you look to the man who is holding the ether in the picture up there, can someone instruct me on this thing? That's not it, right? It's the on-off button. That's Warren Zapol, the last chair before we got one from UCSF. They all dressed up, and the artist took the picture, and that's how it went. So there was a little debate when Ted was there, a little argy-bargy, should we rename the Ether Dome to his favorite anesthetic, which was isoflurane. Here it is. So, going back to when we started interacting, it's incredible how ignorant we were. And all we really knew was we had all these anesthetics and no lock and key would work. And so the debate revolved is, do these all have one target or do they have many targets? And really, in order to make any progress with what the tools we had at the time, the only way to work was to assume they had one target, because otherwise it was chaos. So this was the last advance in the field, pretty much, when Ted and I came into it. About 1900, these guys modeled the site of anesthesia with a jar of olive oil, and it's still one of the best correlations around. You can see even isofluranes on it. Even the nitrogen you're breathing now is on it. At 38 atmospheres, you'd be all asleep. So this was as far as we could go, and we just assumed that any animal, human, who was at that dose was asleep, and it just meant when the anesthetic reached something like 25 millimolar in your lipid bilayer, you would go to sleep. We didn't know much more than that. But we thought we could actually very accurately predict it, the potency of any compound. So a long time ago, I was a failing physical chemistry graduate student. When my boss came back, Brian Smith, from working with Hildebrand, all fired up because I was determining the solubility of a very insoluble gas, sulfur hexafluoride, that barely dissolved in water at all. And he'd just come back from a sabbatical with Joel Hildebrand, who had suggested that helium would be a great diving gas. Well, turned out that SF6 was a terrible diving gas, but that's another story. So I was set to sort of change gears and start working with the head of pharmacology, Sir William Peyton. And he told me to go and figure out, how do you get a good endpoint for anesthesia? So at that point, I found the Eager paper from 1965 and duly typed it into the introduction to my thesis with a few errors, and off we went. In fact, Sir William didn't like MAC because it involved pain, and he didn't think we should involve pain that confuses with anesthesia. Anyway, the other lucky break I had was that Linus Pauling, a very famous guy, came up with a new theory of anesthesia, which was that anesthetics actually had crystals of water that formed hydrates around them in particular proteins that were very good for consciousness. So one of my tasks became, how the hell do we sort this out? So because we already had these very anomalous gases, so this is the hydrate dissociation pressure and anesthetic potency, we determined their anesthetic potency, and as you can see, they didn't fit on his lovely correlation. And then the other prediction he made, though, was that helium and neon don't form hydrates and therefore should not be anesthetics. And so with Bill Street, who was on sabbatical there, had a lot of pressure stuff. We did some experiments on mice and found that at tolerable pressures, indeed, it didn't. So it was sort of one plus for Linus and one negative. So shortly after that, I ran out of money, which is not unusual around here, right? All researchers are used to this moment in life. And I ended up in Berkeley and became a physical chemist again. I was sitting in the basement, the D level. It wasn't even the basement, it was the dungeon level, doing some more solubility gas work when the telephone rang, and guess who that was? It was Ted. I don't know how he knew I was there, how he found me. So Ted said, got to meet, I got to talk about your papers. So, okay, decided to meet. Well, Berkeley, 1967, early in the year, was a strange place, but Ted said, we'll meet in Sproul Plaza. This is Sproul Plaza, and it had lots of people in it, and so it wasn't so easy to find him. So here I am seeking Ted, and alas, I got the trick. That hat. So we sat on the plaza. I guess we had lunch. I'm not sure if Larry was there. I think there was one other person, but it's a long time ago. Might have been. And we discussed a couple of things, the use of fluorinated gases and what that was all about, and then the whole idea of using helium, which, although we hadn't put it in the science paper, we had discovered would reverse anesthesia in mice. So what happened next? Ted took off to Lund, Sweden, because they had a pressure chamber, and worked with Claes Lundgren, and they could determine the anesthetic potency of CF4 and SF6. So they took this a step further, and he suggested I write an editorial. Well, heck, I'm only just a little postdoc, I'll do it, Ted. Actually, I read it. I haven't read it for years. It's actually quite good, but... So that was published in February '69, shortly after I got back to England. And just a little later, I gave a talk in Columbia, and this guy, Dick Kitts, hustled into the library. He had read my editorial, he knew about me, he wanted to hire me. So, one strike for Ted. If it wasn't for Ted, I might not have been there. So I'm going to do just a bit of cartoon science here. So in those days, everybody was interested in lipid fluidity, and it seemed a natural extension of the lipid or olive oil hypothesis. And, there were papers that said if you studied the lipids in reindeers' legs, they got more and more unsaturated as you got to the far end of the leg because it was colder down there, and they had to stay fluid. It was, just like the oil, your multigrade oil you put in your car. So there was tons of interest in lipid fluidity. So this became, Jim Trudell and I and many others sort of started out on this track. And you can see that in real membranes, there's this whole array of these packed. This is cholesterol, a phospholipid. If you stuff halothane in there, they have to give. There's no space, so the fluid chains get disordered. And this fitted very nicely with pressure reversal, and here's sort of what we were thinking. So you take the seat of consciousness, which is some unknown protein surrounded by lipid. We dissolve anesthetics, we go to sleep, we put pressure in, the anesthetics actually stay there, but the chains come straightened out a bit. And here is the proof using not the sort of anesthetics I usually use, but clinical ones with long-acting anesthetic. And you can see that if you do the dose-response curve of phenobarbital, every time you raise the pressure, it moves to the right. So that was pressure reversal. So Ted built, I was always envious, I guess he had some money that I didn't have, he built this beautiful stainless steel pressure chamber. It was just fantastic. Took up most of his lab, and he didn't have much space. Many years later, sorry, that comes later. So the other reason, if you're practical for studying pressure reversal of anesthesia, was that Thresher, the submarine, had vanished, and the US Navy said it could only dive to 300 feet to look for it. And at that point, a Swiss guy, of all things, had the temerity to dive to 600 feet. So the Office of Naval Research was rather embarrassed, and so they started throwing money at this. So this was one of the reasons that we studied pressure reversal. We had funding from the Office of Naval Research. And here's a meeting we had at Sea Ranch, a rather nice place, up the coast. Some of you will be familiar with it. And who was there? You can see the ringed, myself with a bit more hair, Brian Smith, who was very influential in my career. Two of Brian's students who later became postdocs with TED, that's Mike Halsey and Ray Smith. Mike is now passed on, but Ray is practicing anesthesia just north of Boston. And this guy over here. And you'll notice, I mean, what I noticed about Ted when I met him in Sproul Plaza was, I mean, Sproul Plaza, right? Nobody's dressed up formally. Was Ted was rather tweedy. He had a nice jacket on and a tie and this, what we call a flat hat in England, which was also tweedy. And sure enough, there it was. So Ted's worked in the end, and you can see that Mike Halsey and Ray Smith are there. They came over here to work with him. Really questioned the critical volume hypothesis, and in the end, we all got better and better tools, and suddenly you could express receptors in frogs' eggs and study the electrophysiology, and you didn't have to work with jars of olive oil any longer or lipid bilayers. You could actually make some progress. So what happened? This role of pressure reversal was never elucidated to this day. Many years later, I got this email from Ted. You may remember the stainless steel pressure chamber that I had constructed. It was all your fault for suggesting pressure reversal to me. We haven't used it in years. So he offered to ship it to me. But we hadn't used ours in years either. So we still don't know what pressure reversal is all about. And I guess nobody's interested at this point. So I ended up at Harvard Medical School. I'm just a chemist. I never did a course in pharmacology. I never did any physiology or anything like that. So here I am teaching medical students who are intimidatingly bright. And I had to talk about how anesthetics work. Well, we didn't know. That was just 2 or 3 slides at those days. So it had to be uptake and distribution, which had been rationalized by Ted and by others in late 50s, early 60s. But how do you get medical students interested in a problem that's really defined by 5 partial differential equations? It's tough. And that's where this book was really useful, because Ted had all kinds of clinical situations where it was useful to know what was going on and you could interpret it with the model. So I learned to start my lectures with saying, if you listen to this, by the end, you will know why we and what we do when a certain situation turns up. And that was critical, and I have a lot to thank Ted for on that basis. So we continued talking and arguing, and you know Ted as well as I do, and it was always a great thing to meet Ted. We never went hiking together. That's my one regret. Unlike Larry's, I'd have loved to have gone with him. So I thought what I would do is then talk about the later years, which in many ways, although he said the best years of his life were the 3 years when he was working with Larry and others here on Mac, in many ways the program project years were his best years. So Ted, rumor has it, was taken to his chairman's office and had a serious conversation. There was not enough money coming in. I guess there weren't enough dollars per square foot or whatever. This is only a story. I have no idea if it's true. But he decided to form a PPG, and since there was really no space at UCSF, it wasn't at Mass General when I got there either. I often think that actually if you took the square feet and divided into the number of papers he published out of those few square feet, you'd have a very large number. So he decided to form a PPG, but he had to get investigators from around the country. And the first bunch he got, none of them had R01s. And I said to Ted, you've got to get 3 people past the post at study section. And if you've got 4 people, none of whom have R01s, you're not going to make it. And he said, oh, we'll be all right. Well, he was very gracious. He said, you told me. But he didn't stop, of course. That persistence came through. We had to try again. So this time, he really got a lot of really good people. He somehow persuaded them to join his team, which is not easy. I mean, I run a PPG, and most people will run away. They don't want to be in your team. They've got their own stuff to do. Or they join because it's a bit of extra money to do what they want. Anyway, it's really hard running a PPG. So he had this PPG without walls, and this is where Ted's personality and his enthusiasm and sheer genius and his persistence came through. And I would say here that I'm very grateful to Adrian Harris, who was a PI on this PPG and knows probably more about it than me. I would come occasionally to be critical. So these meetings here at San Francisco were the TED Fest, is what we called them in the end, and 1 or 2 of you around here know the TED Fest. They were unique. They were actually the best mechanisms of anesthesia meeting at the time there were, because Ted had a knack. So they were hard work. So he wanted me as a reviewer and an advisor, just going to send me 4 grants to review. And luckily I might have 10 days to do it in. But he did tell me ahead of time so I could block out the time. So we'd have a meeting, and you'd get an email from Ted saying, what a wonderful meeting. Time to organize the next one. And there would be a list of dates that you had to cross off. And he held these meetings every 6 months, and they were all fantastic meetings. Somehow he had a way of getting us to almost kill each other with arguments and then come out of it okay at the end. There were they were very critical. He wanted his PPG to be really good, and he got the best out of us. He derived great pleasure from them. He just loved these meetings. Even though on occasion he would storm out of the room after we criticized one of his ideas and retreat to his office, and on one occasion it was 2 hours before he came out. That was just before a study section, and I think Mervyn had to leave. He was there. Ted was talking TED Talk that wasn't going to get much kudos at study section, shall we say. But he just loved these meetings. He reveled in them. So the timetables were intense. You can see we started at 7:30, and we were all in the little room where I guess the residents had their desks, and we were all crammed in. And there were lots of talks and lots of commentaries, and quite a constellation of people. There's Jim Trudell, who we mentioned recently, but Yoda, Cantor, Overdune, very few from San Francisco. And then we'd have in the middle, we'd have Peter Coleman, a terrific chemist, lunch, and then we'd all have to line up and say what we thought about all the other speakers and try and polish this so it would become a paper or a new grant and so on. And I think there's one other name I should just mention there, Ross Tyrrell, who was the chemist who made a lot of the, isn't that right, Steve? I think he was involved in the synthesis of a lot of the volatile agents we use now. All of them, yeah. Mm-hmm. But Ted's genius. We always ended up at La Bergière, where we had a nice dinner, and then we got up at about 6 in the morning and started again. I was saying to Michael, the breakfast here was much better than we were used to at Ted's meetings. And the coffee was terrible. But luckily, Neil Harrison and I, on the way from the Stanton Park Hotel as we walked up the hill, the only exercise we get that day, we passed the Lava Java and got huge cups of coffee and arrived at the breakfast with that. And this is day 2 of the TED Fest. That was the normal length, but some of them went for 3 days, and usually you were exhausted by the end of them. But you had great memories and you'd done a lot of good science. So Adrian Harris was one of his key PIs. Adrian's actually an alcohol researcher, but we were all interested in GABA receptors, basically. And these are what he remembers. I mean, like me, he remembers them as just being fantastic. Ted made it so exciting and so rigorous. He brought people together with very different expertise and got them to excite each other, respect each other, well, sometimes, and collaborate. And he really pushed us. He really pushed us. You couldn't get up and give a talk without, we really went after all the logic, all the data, and that was just terrific. And yet, somehow Ted kept us all friends. So after a decade of these rigorous and exhausting meetings, I found this email. People got to like the TED Fests. Ted writes, I usually got teased for making plans so far in advance. But this time the shoe may be on the other foot. So, and there's the list of dates we have to choose from. However, he kept going. So a year later, it's a bit less than a year and a half to the competing renewal. So the organization was phenomenal. I mean, he never let you stop. It was just great. So this was the last TED Fest that Adrian organized, actually in San Francisco, 2012. TED had, I think the PPG had not been renewed was the time. It's Ted giving his talk there, a very nice picture of Ted. And that's actually, most of the scientists who were there are there, and you can see they came from around the place. Some of them you'll know anyway, I don't need to point those out. Am I out of juice here? That's Nick Franks from England, myself here. Jim Sonner, who's not here today. This is Adrian Harris, and a whole bunch of people, most of whom you'll recognize because they're in anesthesia, a couple of alcohol researchers, but they all came there. And what else can one say? That was the one constant in the whole thing. I like this picture because it's kind of Ted. He's looking at you. He's got a slight smile on his face. And he's probably calling his wife to get a ride home. But so there, I'll have to leave it.